We now will invite our panelists for the second session and get into the second session. The emerging challenges to peace and security in Northeast Asia, Korean Peninsula, Japan, and maritime dispute. President Park In-guk of the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies will moderate this session. Please welcome the panelists with a big hand.
Good morning again. Excuse me. Moderating immediately after Dr. Moon Jae-in is like, delivering some speech after Shakespeare. It's my big mistake to put him in the first, the session. First of all, I'd like to introduce the top, notch, panelists, which we deal with the really important issues, all of us. Emerging challenges to peace and security in Northeast Asia, Korean Peninsula, Japan, and maritime dispute. I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Bush on my left first. He's working as a director for the East Asia Policy Studies in Brookings Institution, where SK made the largest contribution in establishing the Korea chair at Brookings, for the first time in the Brookings history. So he is a locomotive in making such great, academic investment in Brookings. He served as the chairman of the American Institute in Taiwan and also National Intelligence Officers for East Asia and a member of the National Intelligence Council. Next speaker will be from from Fudan University's Professor SHEN Dingli. He worked as an associate dean at Fudan University Institute of International Studies. As you might be well aware, Fudan University is specialized in American studies, within China. So maybe he is one of the leading scholars who is specialized in American issues. He has very special, academic background. He got a PhD in physics. So that's why I expect you might have some very excellent and scientific analysis on current North Korean nuclear program. The next speaker will be Professor Lee Jung-hoon. You might well much on him. He is a professor at Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei Universities, and he is also director of the Yonsei University's Center for Modern Korean Studies as well as the Center for American Studies. Actually, he served as a leading designer of the current Park Geun-hye government's foreign policies. And he's working as a special ambassador for human rights representing Korean government. And the next left, Bob EINHORN. He's we call him genius and working dictionary on North Korean nuclear issues. So whenever we have some meeting, we don't have to make re-summarize. If we just quote if we dictate what he said, it's kind of good, report to my home government. So actually, I met with him when he working as assistant secretary, of Paul Mill of Foggy Bottom in 1993 when I worked in my mission, my embassy. So it was since that time we traveling every year, almost every year, without any fruitful, result. But so So he has been involved in North Korean nuclear issues more than almost 3 decades, right? So now recently he joined Brookings. So maybe it is great. I hope you will be great asset to Brookings. And ZHU Feng, my old friends of mine, in China. Now he's working as a professor at the School of International Studies of Peking University. Now he's assumed to new job as executive director of China Center for Collaborative Innovation of the South China Sea Studies at Nanjing Universities. So maybe he will have some. I expect you will have some your own, insight on the key maritime dispute issues. And the Professor Park Chul-hee, he's the most authoritative, expert on Japanese issues. Today, unfortunately, we don't have any Japanese, to speak on behalf of Japan. But I think he will very objectively deliver what is the Japanese position and what should be done on the future of our relationship with Japan. So, Professor Park published too many articles and books, and also he's enjoying as one of the great columnists at various Japanese journals. So I need it's high time. I need your great applaud for our excellent panelists. How we could organize my session? Basically, I will be more generous than Professor Moon. So I'll try to minimize my question against you. But I cannot resist any instant the questions from audience. I will give you 10 to 12 minutes for the 3 key presenters, and then 8 to 10 minutes. But I hope you will not use all the time, maybe. So 3 discussants, 8 to 10 times. But even though we have a big time constraint, but given your wonderful, your excellent expertise on each area, so you may raise your own comment or presentation on top of just responding to 3 previous the speakers. That is some. That's why I'd like to be more generous. To give 2 more minutes. So, and then we'll have some our internal discussion. Based on bad precedent of the by former moderator Professor Moon, and then I will collect some written memos, on whatever question or comment from audience side. So, with such kind of understanding in mind, I'd like to invite Mr. Richard Bush.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Park, and I want to thank you for your dedicated energy in bringing this event about. And I really appreciate all the hard work of the Korea Foundation of Academic Studies for putting on a wonderful program. And it's good to see a lot of former colleagues. I actually have 5 emerging challenges, so I need to move quickly because I have only 2 minutes for each one. And the first one may seem a little odd to you. It is the degradation of our physical and human environment. We all know, or we should know, that climate change, with its effect on weather and therefore agriculture, the sea level, water supply, will reshape life in Northeast Asia as we know it. Coastal areas of China will be in danger of getting underwater. I'm sorry, Dingli, to tell you that. The glacier-fed water supplies of China, India, and Southeast Asia are already in decline because of the disappearance of glaciers. Natural disasters will increase in number and severity, and those who are at the greatest risk will be the least able to cope. But more importantly, the interactive and cumulative attacks on our environment will have national security consequences. We usually refer to climate change as a non-traditional security issue. Well, that may be, but it will produce hard security conflicts. The stresses that environmental change will place on our collective economic futures will create zero-sum situations when it comes to security. And so this is, if we're thinking long-term, this is probably the challenge that we should be most concerned about. The second challenge is what I call strategic rivalry between China and the United States. And we actually talked about this quite a bit in the first session. My understanding of China's idea of a new pattern of great power relations is that it is a way to prevent strategic rivalry from inevitably happening between the United States and China. Obviously, whether China and America end up as rivals will shape how all other lesser security challenges and issues are addressed, whether it's climate change or North Korea. Conversely, how Beijing and Washington address today and address in the future these lesser issues will help determine the degree of strategic rivalry. If we do a good job in handling all these other issues, then we are less likely to be rivals. But the opposite is also true. Now, in thinking about strategic rivalry, it's obvious that the more we mistrust each other's long-term intentions, the more likely we will be rivals. My understanding of the United States approach to shaping China's choices in a more, or the U.S. approach is to try to shape China's choices in a more positive direction, and we've heard about various means of engagement, integrating China in the international community, pushing back a little bit when necessary. But there's no guarantee that this will work, and China in its own way is trying to shape the choices of the United States and its allies and friends in the region. But the outcome of this interaction is going to be extremely important. My third challenge is North Korea. It's not really an emerging challenge, it's more a chronic challenge, but it also evolves. And the situation with North Korea today is not the same as it was 10 years ago. It's a multifaceted challenge. North Korea has conventional forces, WMD program, special operations forces. Its diplomacy is sometimes disruptive. The greatest danger, in my view, is some sort of new DPRK limited conventional strike against South Korea that escalates into a broader conflict. The initial action may not have that serious consequences, but it's the interactive responses to that that are so dangerous. More for the long term, the DPRK's WMD capability will raise questions about extended deterrence. I'm not going to talk about that because my colleague Bob EINHORN will discuss it. Unification in whatever form it takes, however it happens, will put a lot of pressure on the United States, China, and North Korea, South Korea. And preserving stability on the peninsula, I think, requires good relations among us all. My fourth challenge are maritime disputes. Ken Lieberthal discussed this effectively before. These are fed by several different factors: territorial disagreements, quest for resources, nationalism. At the present time, I think what makes this a dangerous set of issues is how various parties assert their territorial claims and their resource claims. And this can be done in an assertive way or not so assertive way. And I agree with Ken that when you have a lot of ships or planes operating in the same area, the chances of some sort of physical clash go up, but once the clash occurs, it's very hard to contain. I think the most useful step for reducing this danger would be measures to reduce risk and to avoid conflict, essentially codes of conduct. Informal restraint is good, formalized restraint is much better. Finally, as my fifth emerging challenge, I'm going to raise Taiwan. That was an emerging challenge of the last decade. Right now it seems fairly calm because leaders on both sides have decided to act in ways that are less threatening to the other and that expand areas of cooperation. So cross-strait relations have been stabilized. China has pursued a patient and incremental strategy. It has prioritized stabilization, what it calls peaceful development, over resolving the fundamental dispute. There's some question as to how far this can go, but the reason I classify this as an emerging challenge is that there is a change going on within Taiwan that suggests that the Taiwan public, or parts of the Taiwan public, are not so positive about the results of this process and are challenging the administration about its policies. I just came from Taiwan, and it's an extremely messy situation where political tactics and mistrust and are controlling the situation right now, and it's not easy to see how the current situation can be resolved or ameliorated. In conclusion, I would say that because we know these challenges are emerging and they will affect us, we have every obligation to take steps to reduce the danger that each poses, whether it's climate change, U.S.-China strategic rivalry, North Korea, and so on. The steps that one country takes will not be the same that another country takes. We'll each have our division of labor. The steps that we take to deal with one emerging challenge will be different from those that we take from the other. But I think it's obvious that working together, China, the United States, and the Republic of Korea have a lot to lose by failing to address these challenges. We have a lot collectively to gain by working together to try and ameliorate them and even solve them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker will be Professor SHEN Dingli.
Thank you very much. I caught cold, so my voice is not good. I have 7 points to make. The major issue for this session to address is emerging challenges. I would address emerging issues. Some of these are challenges, some of these are a phenomenon, and that could be developed as a challenge, but that also can be managed. And many of them are emerging, but many of them are existing. But as Richard has mentioned, could continue to evolve. Number one, the Korean Peninsula. North Korea, in my personal take, will continue to push the nuclear envelope. We would not abandon our determination to reverse this negative trend. But as a pragmatist, I would predict that North Korea would continue, whatever we do. Therefore, we have feel much frustrated, especially last year. Chinese president, new president Xi Jinping, had to use his personal credit to demand North Korea to stop. And he spoke at the Asian Forum to denounce such irresponsible behavior without mentioning Pyongyang's name. We have been pushing for bringing the six-party talk back without success. And my personal take is even it could be resumed, I would not pay great hope that the DPRK would take meaningful action to dismantle its nuclear whistle. So probably when Bob was in the State Department, his government used to have a policy toward India and Pakistan. Freeze, to put a ceiling first, put a freezing first and then capping and then reversing. So I would personally say that has failed toward both India and Pakistan. But at least we should try toward the DPRK to dismantle at this time seems not to be pragmatic. To have a freezing, don't do more, and to have a capping to start the process toward reversing and dismantling might be more pragmatic. I know many friends sitting here would not like this idea, but this is the best I can ever conceive at this later time. Given the execution of John Sonntag, there are two different schools of speculation whether the regime is more stable after doing this, or this has shown more instability, the cracking of the regime inside. That takes time to see. Japan, point two, is apparently drifting towards the right-wing direction. Its revisionist approach to history, especially by serving Prime Minister to pay visit to Yasukuni Shrine in official capacity, has invited a whole spectrum of response from disappointment to condemnation. So this morning I heard China may have demanded Japan to announce officially not to repeat such a mistake as a precondition for the resumption of the summit meeting between Beijing and Seoul and Tokyo. I hope this is a reasonable demand and Japan need to take this seriously. My own country, I would not see that many of our development as a threat, as a challenge, but as this is a kind of a holistic summation of all these emerging security issues, I would still include China as my third point. The rising defense budget spending, the official announcement is about a quarter to the US this year, comparing with what was 1 out of 18 in the year 2000 was amazing. And this will be bigger than the sum of all major Asia-Pacific powers except for the United States. So there should be a response, either psychologically or a concrete action that China need to predict and need to be prepared. There is a way for China to smooth possible negative response to this by explaining it, by providing better explanation and transparency, and best to forge in collaboration with other major actors in the region, regional multilateral security system. Therefore, every stakeholder need to spend less, and the total security could be increased. Air defense identification zone from East China Sea to South China Sea is all possible. How to avoid the pitfall of creating this while hoping to improve China's legitimate security, but also to take care of others' security concern. America, back to Asia, or back to Middle East, or back to Europe. There is debate. But the apparent sequestration has much weakened the U.S. ability to spend for its defense. And back in Asia, rebalancing would make the U.S. to appropriate more resource in the region actually probably without spending more resources globally, how China would look at this in a way that is scientific, objective, not to underestimate and not to overestimate, and still to work with the U.S. To have the cooperative reduction of threat perception. China may be unnecessarily perceive the U.S. To pose extra threat. U.S. May be still confident to handle China, but increasingly seem to be less confident as it used to be. Maritime, my fifth point. In Northeast Asia, we are talking about Northeast Asia. I can talk about a lot about the South China Sea, but this is Northeast Asia. Maritime dispute exists primarily between China and Japan. And Diaoyu Island or Senkaku, which is a major friction point. I would say the two countries would exercise maximum self-restraint. The chance to have a bigger conflict is almost zero, but incidental or unauthorized friction is not impossible. So how to avoid this, to create a China-Japan security and confidence building system, which is particularly lacking at this time, is crucial. But China has mandated that all this can be done when trust at the political level can be restored. That would again warrant Japan to agree not to return to Yasukuni for their public officials in open capacity, whether Japan can accommodate. China-Japan relationship has been much deteriorated over years. Now both are hedging against possible conflict, but I think at the same time they are slandering against each other using global public diplomacy, which is very disturbing. America, my last point is China-US relation. America is the key. America is behind China's inability to have national integration. American may think America is not the core factor, but is behind. And America has made it clear to defend Japan, citing a defense treaty if there is a trouble between Beijing and Tokyo on Diaoyu Island. So China is doing its own counter-rebalancing approach, in my view, that may make effective cooperation between China and U.S. in the region less effective. Therefore, Beijing and Washington need to take a fresh look, how to look at each other through criticism and self-criticism approach, not to pointing to each other in the first place, but to look at how to avoid to excite the other side by my side in the first place. There are a lot to do. Cyberspace is a new area the two countries can collaborate. Last year, the two countries set up their cyber security working group in the SAED framework. I'm not informed about the internal working, but I feel this is a positive development. Someday, China may admit it does have defensive cyber force for defensive purpose. But if China is attacked in the first place, China does have the right to counterattack. We need to admit that we need to defend, but defense and offense are the two sides of one coin. So China and U.S. need to have dialogue. I'm glad that we have handled the Edward Snowden case in a neat way that has not hurt the relationship further. So a vast amount of area China and U.S. need to work on, and we have lots of challenges. Diaoyu Island, North Korea's provocative behavior. All this also offer us opportunity, and we should manage them to prevent them and to defeat such a threat. Through such a process, sort of more trustful China-U.S. Major country partnership could be established, and the U.S. will be more willing to accommodate China's need to be respected as a respectful major power. And China would rise without challenging Americans' dominance in the region, which itself has provided public goods to everybody in the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Lee Jung-un.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I just want to express my deep sense of appreciation and also congratulate Ambassador Park In-guk and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for hosting and organizing such a wonderful conference. It's very rare for an international conference in Korea to be drawing close to 1,000 audience. I hope it establishes itself as one of the more important venues for discussions on regional issues as we are doing today. Now on to issues of Northeast Asia. I mean, certainly there are, as currently and also in the previous session already discussed, some developments of major concern. The resurgence of the conflicting territorial claims, the return or the exacerbation of the historical memories, the inability to deal with the emotional irreconciliation in the region. In fact, it's getting worse. And what appears to be, at least to some, this hegemonic rivalry between the United States and China. The situation is such that it's lending some alarmist comparisons to the state of things 100 years ago when the region was inflamed in imperialistic hegemony or hegemonic battles. President Park Geun-hye has alluded to the current situation in this region as an Asian paradox. What she meant is that despite the vibrance of the economic relations in this region, it doesn't seem to have a positive spillover effect on the political and security issues. In fact, political and security issues in some areas are getting worse despite the economic interdependence. And to understand this paradox, I think it's very important to examine some of the key driving forces that's dictating the way things are today and probably into the future. And I identify basically 6 of them. One, of course, is the continuing U.S. interest and military presence in the region. 2, the rise of China, or rather the direction of the rise of China, if it already hasn't risen. 3, the resurgence of Japanese ultra-nationalism, and again, the direction of this into the future. And 4thly, North Korea's continuing nuclear brinkmanship, and also the viability of the young leadership in North Korea under Kim Jong-un. And 5thly, conflicting territorial claims and how the region is able to cope with the past issues. And finally, the economic interdependence, whether it be in FTAs or TPP and so on. Because of the time limit, I will just give some snap summaries of some of these driving forces. First, the United States, already a lot of discussions on the Asian pivot, the rebalancing. Obviously, it's about strengthening U.S. commitment to this region. But why? Why the rebalancing? Why the Asia pivot? Well, number one, because this region is probably the most economically dynamic region in the world. There's wealth, there's much to be gained, very profitable, there's lots of prosperity, there's lots of development. So why would anyone not want to be fully engaged and involved in this region? So I think part of the reason of the Asia pivot has to do with that. And then, of course, the second reason, and this is something that's already been talked about quite a bit, which has to do with the China factor. In the previous session, of course, Professor Chung Jae-ho mentioned of the A2AD, the Chinese strategy. Now, if you look at the time-honored principles of U.S. foreign policy, one of which has always been open door policy. U.S. does not like markets or areas being closed off to U.S. access. And there's a little bit of that sort of sense in the A2AD strategy. So this is something that the United States is trying to counter. Maybe that's part of the rebalancing in the form of continuing military presence, in terms of strengthening the MD, in terms of reiterating the extended deterrence, in terms of U.S. trying to cultivate new relations or strengthening relations with Vietnam, the Philippines, Myanmar, and so on and so forth. The result, of course, has been the Chinese feeling, to some degree, a sense of encirclement, and maybe as part of that, the creation of the Chinese ADIs a few months ago. Speaking of China, someone quite a long time ago talked about China as an existential threat, just being so big and just being there. It's considered by the neighbors as a threat? Or is it simply a benign or peaceful engine of world growth? Or maybe both. In 2013, of course, President Xi Jinping, in his meeting with President Obama, talked about the new kind of great power relations. Well, not so fast because of the ADIs, and also, you'll recall, the naval standoff between the two countries involving U.S. cruiser Cowpens. So, obviously there are tensions, and of course the United States cannot be completely detached from China's territorial issues, whether it's Spratly's, Parasols, the Scarborough, whether it's Eodo or Senkaku. These are all issues that the United States is very much concerned with. But does it warrant a new Cold War? I don't think so, because I think the two countries just have too much at stake. The trade volume, as I understand, is about, $500 billion. So we may not go to that extent, but clearly the bilateral relations between the two countries will be up and down. Japan and its ultra-nationalistic drive. I don't think there's anything wrong with a sovereign state or the sovereign state's leaders being patriotic or making some nationalistic pitches. But we have a problem when that patriotism is manifested in looking into and really when it touches on sensitive issues, especially to its neighboring countries, such as the comfort women issue, and so on. So why? Again, the question on Japan, why is it doing it? Well, probably because of this kind of newfound strong leadership. It's led to the electoral successes for the Abe government. I think there's also the psychological factor of, this is not the first time that Abe is the prime minister. His first prime ministership was not very strong, and it ended with, with his physical condition. So maybe Prime Minister Abe feels a little embarrassed about that, so he's trying to sort of make up for the not so successful first term. I don't know, maybe you can make some, analogies to the Kennedy administration. His firm stance in the Cuban Missile Crisis, maybe as as sort of a makeup for the Bay of Pigs fiasco. I don't know if the comparison is justified, but I think there's that psychological dimension to this. There's also the calculation of the U.S. military budget cut, but in spite of that, the U.S. rebalancing and Japan firmly staying within the U.S. camp in whatever the United States is doing in the Asia-Pacific region, and thinking that because Japan is making such a firm stance on behalf of the United States, that maybe the United States might turn blind eye to some of these issues that Japan has with the neighboring countries. And finally, maybe to offset the possibility of the economic downturn. Abenomics, there's no guarantee of its success. It is uncertain. So by taking this ultra-nationalistic approach could serve to offset whatever uncertainties there may be. in the economic field. Whatever the reasons, South Korea-Japan relations has soured to the point where President Obama, as you know, on the sidelines of the nuclear summit, arranged a trilateral summit meeting. Is it enough? Simple answer is no. So what will it take? I'm not very positive about Japan and South Korea on our own being able to normalize our bilateral relations. So I think the United States has to play a much more active intervening role if it wants its two allies in Asia to mend the fences, if you will. Like, for example, back in mid-1960s, in the critical years of 1964 and 1965, when South Korea and Japan normalized relations with Japan, United States played a very, very important role and very participatory role, if you will. It took the Vietnam War for the United States to make that kind of a pitch. What will it take now? Is the question that we might want to raise. On North Korea, the brinkmanship continues. New form of nuclear test. Will there be another nuclear test? Of course, there will be another nuclear test because yes, the world is saying that we're not going to tolerate another nuclear test, but we've heard that before. We've heard that before the third nuclear test. We've heard that before the second nuclear test. And we certainly heard that before the very first nuclear test. The sad part and the dangerous part is that North Korea knows that, which means that North Korea knows that, yes, there will be condemnations, maybe another Security Council resolution, but they know that it's not the end of the world. They know that they can overcome this because the international community will come around to knock on door and ask North Korea to come back to the negotiations table. So, therein lies, of course, is the dilemma. North Korea is fully committed to becoming a nuclear state. Why? Because it wants to be untouchable. It wants to be invulnerable because, the new UN COI report suggests that there's genocide going on in North Korea. North Korea is running the country in manners that's unacceptable to the international community. So North Korea basically wants to make sure that nobody sort of intervenes to change or alter the situation. Where's the ceiling? Where's the red line? If the world is genuine about North Korea's nuclear issue or human rights issue, it really has to do so much more because what is the alternative? I mean, can we imagine? I mean, North Korea, the world is having enough trouble with North Korea as it is. Can you imagine how North Korea will be if it had genuine deployed nuclear weapons? It's unimaginable, particularly for Korea, South Korea. South Korea will be held hostage, and I would argue that even the U.S. extended deterrence will be seriously damaged if North Korea is able to have deployed nuclear weapons that can target U.S. forward bases, whether that's Guam or elsewhere. And this concern over North Korea relates to my conclusion, which is that, yes, we have all these problems within Asia, between Japan and South Korea, China and Japan, and so on and so forth. It's very important to find a common front amongst these countries. And I really cannot find anything except for North Korea. So North Korea has to serve as a common front for the regional powers to come together. Because if we're not able to come together on the North Korean issue now, in 5 years' time, maybe we'll have the trilateral conference in 5 years' time, but then we'll be talking about how do we go about preventing 10th North Korean nuclear test? Or maybe even worse, how do we try to limit North Korea's nuclear stockpile to 30 instead of 50? And I have to ask that questions to everyone here attending this conference. Is this what we want? Because if we just talk about it and not put things into action, that's exactly what we'll be talking about in 5 years down the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Now it's time for
Thank you.
Bob Einhorn.
Thank you, Ambassador Park, and thank you for the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for inviting me and putting on this conference. And where Jung-hoon left off, I would like to begin, because I'd like to devote these brief remarks to an assessment of what might be called the nuclear order in Northeast Asia. It's been a relatively stable nuclear order for 20, 30 years, but it's increasingly come under stress. And I think the principal reason the nuclear order has come under stress is the nuclear and missile programs of North Korea. We've seen evidence of provocative North Korean activity in this area in recent weeks. The firing of multiple missiles and rockets, talk about not ruling out a new type of nuclear test. Of most concern is the apparent North Korean renunciation of the goal of denuclearization and the assertion that North Korea is an eternal nuclear weapon state, at least until all other nuclear weapon states get rid of their own nuclear weapons. And I agree with Mr. Lee that the intention of the North Koreans is to have a nuclear-armed missile capable of hitting the United States, because it believes that if it can get that, it can engage in troublemaking in the region with impunity, without the risk of U.S. retaliation, for fear that North Korea could then hit the United States. So this is a real concern, and this is where developments are now heading. But a second source of stress is the behavior of China. China is engaged now in a very ambitious strategic modernization program. Now, there's nothing wrong with China modernizing its strategic forces. It has every right to make sure that it has a secure retaliatory capability. And I think that's primarily what is motivating China at this moment. But its lack of transparency about these programs are what is causing a lot of concern among China's neighbors. It needs to be more transparent. An accompanying problem is what I regard as a greater Chinese regional assertiveness. We see this in the Air Defense Identification Zone, in the dispute over what Ken Lieberthal calls the DS Islands problem, and this too is causing stress for the nuclear order. Now, a third source of stress is the perception that the United States can no longer be counted upon as a guarantor of security in the region. I think this is a fundamentally wrong perception, but notwithstanding the rebalance of the Obama administration, there is a concern within the region that because of budgetary and other kinds of pressures, the U.S. is not as committed to stability and security in the region as it once was. Again, I think this is fundamentally wrong, but this is the narrative that seems to be gaining currency here, and I think we need to recognize and address it. Now, these three trends, I think, have given rise to another very worrisome trend, and that is a number of countries in the region, and specifically I'm talking about Japan and the ROK here, have begun at least to think about whether they want to remain non-nuclear weapon states. In my view, there remains a very low probability that either Japan or South Korea would decide to opt for indigenous nuclear weapons programs. But you see increasingly politicians in both capitals are beginning to talk about the possibility of acquiring indigenous nuclear capabilities. I think this is very, very worrisome. A fifth and final source of stress is not on the military side of the equation, but on the civilian side. The three countries of Northeast Asia, China, ROK, Japan, have robust civil nuclear programs. They rely on nuclear energy for their electricity generation more than any other countries in the world, at least as a region. What we see in each of these countries are developments that are somewhat concerning. In Japan, despite the Fukushima disaster, we see Abe's government committed to reviving the nuclear energy industry of Japan. And I think that's a very good idea. But we also see it committed to starting this large commercial reprocessing facility at Rokasho. Now, it's a very good development that at the Nuclear Security Summit just a few weeks ago in The Hague, the Japanese agreed to turn back over to the United States over 300 kilograms of weapons-grade, highly enriched uranium and plutonium. This is very positive. But if Rokasho starts up before the end of the year, this will increase Japan's stock of weapons-usable plutonium. Japan owns 44 tons of separated plutonium. Much of that is in Europe, but about 9 tons of it is in Japan. And if Rokasho begins, especially without nuclear reactors online to burn some of the plutonium as mixed oxide fuel, you're going to get increasing stocks of separated plutonium, and that's going to give rise to concerns about the security of those stocks. The ROK is also expanding its reliance on nuclear energy. There was a brief pause in the program to review the safety of nuclear reactors in the ROK, but I have full confidence in the safety of those reactors, and they will start up, and there will be an expansion of the ROK nuclear energy program. Now, South Korea believes that it needs to have both a reprocessing capability and a uranium enrichment capability in order to have a robust civil nuclear energy program. The United States disagrees with that assessment. It believes that President Park's key objectives in the nuclear energy area can be met without resort to these sensitive fuel cycle capabilities. And I think there's a recognition among South Korean experts that these civil nuclear goals can be achieved without enrichment or reprocessing. But the problem, it has become more political and even emotional because what the ROK sees is that Japan has the right to pursue these technologies, but the ROK does not. I think this is going to be a difficult problem to resolve. China has perhaps the most ambitious nuclear energy program in the region. Its rate of production of new reactors is extraordinary, I think unprecedented in history, but it too is going to pursue the plutonium recycle path. It's going to work with France to have a large commercial reprocessing facility, notwithstanding the fact that many countries who have had this capability have decided to get rid of them because they're not commercially viable, they don't help with resource conservation, they don't help with spent fuel management, and that includes the United States, Germany, Sweden, and many other countries. But China is going down this path. China also has developed programs to ensure the security of its nuclear assets, and that's impressive, but given the huge dimension of the China program, I think this is going to be a challenge for China. And China has not been as transparent in this area as it ought to be, and that would be important. So what needs to be done to address these problems? One, it's important to address the North Korea nuclear and missile problem much more seriously. Part of that is to give North Koreans incentives to choose a different path. And in that connection, President Park's Dresden Initiative is a very good start. But it takes much more than that. It's important to impress on Kim Jong-un that his strategy of simultaneously pursuing nuclear deterrence and economic development simply will not work. And to do that, China has to get much tougher with the North Koreans. China has genuinely tried over recent months to put pressure on North Korea to persuade it to change course. But it's become very frustrated because the North Koreans aren't easy to deal with. But I think it's going to be very important as the Chinese continue the recalibration of their policy to North Korea to come to the conclusion that halfway measures will not succeed. They really have to decide that enough is enough, and China has to use the full weight of its leverage against North Korea to get it to change course. Second, it's important that dialogues be carried out with China to ensure stability in the East Asia region. The United States needs to have a genuine strategic dialogue with China to ensure strategic stability. The Chinese and the Japanese have to get together and figure out how to resolve the islands dispute in a peaceful way. Third, the United States, and here we talked about, Richard talked about extended deterrence. The United States has to continue to play an active, stabilizing role in the region. I believe, and I hope many of you believe, that the U.S. commitment to its allies in the region, and that's primarily Japan and the ROK, that those commitments have helped ensure the stability of the region for the last several decades. And that's going to have to continue. It's already continuing in light of North Korean belligerent actions, both with respect to Seoul and with respect to Tokyo. It's important that that continue. I understand that our Chinese friends sometimes perceive the bolstering of extended deterrence as a threat to China. But I hope that our Chinese friends will recognize that strengthening that and maintaining and strengthening that extended deterrent is in the interest of stability in the region and China's interest as well. Finally, in terms of civil nuclear energy, there is some cooperation among the three nuclear energy giants of Northeast Asia, cooperation in the safety area, but it's minimal and it could be improved. But there are many areas where the nuclear energy interests of the Northeast Asian countries overlap, and there can be coordination and even joint work. One is in the nuclear security area. They could compare notes, exchange best practices, and this would be very important. But a common problem that all of them will have is spent fuel storage. This is becoming an acute problem in Japan, in South Korea, and sooner or later it will be an acute problem in China. They can work together on interim solutions, such as the production of dry cask storage in all of these countries, which would help in the interim. But they could also talk about having a regional repository for spent fuel, for more permanent disposal of spent fuel. There are many areas where the nuclear energy interests of the three countries overlap. And I know this is difficult because this is a very sensitive matter, and there are all kinds of bilateral difficulties that have been discussed this morning. But I think if the three countries got together, looked at their common challenges, and worked on them together, then this stressful element of the nuclear order would be a lot easier to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for your impeccable, visiting every corner of the WMD issues. Next speaker will be Professor ZHU Feng.
Okay, first of all, let me thank President Park, Ching-Kuo, and Jonathan inviting me here. It's truly my big honor. I just have a couple of points to share with you. First of all, let me start in my comments from Dr. Richard Bush's illuminative accounts on what is going on with regional security. I think President Dr. Bush's accounts is really very, precise and concisely presented. Then, such as 5 key points, Chile just offers some sort of a full description of what is just, we say, threatening the regional security. But one thing I'm just trying to alter here is, for example, what sort of the leading driver behind the regional security dynamic, if it is just a positive, disruptive, or some sort of a mixed, we say, the package. I think most importantly, it's a power shift. And it's also become some sort of a new addition to the greater power relations, and also just tap into different, the security responses from the regional players. I think that 30 years ago, China's military was a flashback. 20 years ago is just a small blip in the radar screen. But today, what's the China's military? Yes, it's getting bigger. China's military spending is also a big controversy. Personally, I'm also a little bit skeptical to how reasonable and viable for China to maintain such a two-digital military spending. But the problem is it's also some sort of consequence of China's domestic logic. Because even in the past 3.5 decades, China's economy is getting better. China's national strength is also growing bigger. But I think the sense of insecurity of my country now is deepening. This is also a reality I really want all our audience and the panelists never just forget it. I think China's deepening sense of insecurity came from two folds. One is the U.S.-led defense or security supremacy in the region remain intractable. But the problem is with China's getting rising, the China's security demand and the national interest requirement spontaneously extends. So how such some sort of a new contradiction could be very firmly and reasonably just dismissed? So far, we also see great power relations. By the end of the day, it's a dirty job. So then China's security requirement could be very legally and very fairly just respect. No. For example, I can give you a case. The South China Sea is now is one of the leading flashpoints. But the problem is joining of the 9-dash line could be dated back to in 1947. It's not the job of the PRC, it's the job of the ROC. But when China drew the 9-dash line, no one protested. No one paid attention to. But now why China just trying to safeguard some sort of 9-dash line based sovereign claim and cause so much, the scream and outcry? The reason is China's Navy is getting bigger. If China could just, we say, very strongly and steadily control the 9-dash line friend South China Sea Islands, I think that China will have some sort of military option to keep the South China Sea, of course, well calmed or overwhelmed by the Chinese Navy. Then the China's strategic presence will also move southward. Then it will be some sort of, we say, a very pesky problem for the United States and some sort of regional players. So from this point, I have to say China needs to clarify the 9-dash line. China should know where the limit is to claim the South China Sea's sovereign territory. So my personal view is Beijing should dislodge some sort of unattainable such a sovereign claim in South China Sea. I don't think where will have any liability to overtake all national lines, friend the southern territories in South China Sea. But the province that caused some sort of, contending feeling and moods. In the eyes of Chinese, we consider Americans harsh. The push for clarification of non-national line is the new evidence of contending policy. Then for the U.S., China's some sort of less flexible response to the South China Sea is the way Beijing is going more aggressive. But I think the core of such a very vicious cycle of action and reaction of the maritime security area in the region is shifted power, is China's growing naval capability. So how such a things could be well, addressed in coming days? Yes, I think our great panelists also picked up a couple of very brilliant points. We need a dialogue. We need some sort of reasonable requirements. But for me, most important thing is we need a strategic prudence. For example, Chinese should know we don't need to overreach. If we're overreach, we will suffer a lot, not just from the backlash of the United States. Then we also will be isolated by our neighbors. But on the other hand, U.S. also should know how to just avoid the cornering Chinese. If the U.S. like to always use a very preemptory tone and cornering China, then it also will just irritate some sort of Chinese, backlash. So U.S. also should know, don't overreact to the China's rising. I think it's also some sort of a big test, not just for how they just feel they indispensable. It's a test on how visionary and wise of both leaders. As last panel just very powerfully demonstrate, now we have different layers, multiple way of dialogues between the U.S. and China. But the province, we also see such a strategic competition, and very adequately pointed by Richard. It's some sort of strategic rivalry now is on the horizon. This situation not just concern Chinese and Americans, then also concern the entire region. So we should just take some sort of action and add it to some sort of a Western, then using the skillful diplomacy to get China-U.S. relations well managed. So that kind of a strategic vision, strategic prudence, really should be easily found out from different leaders in the region. Then second point I want to respond to is North Korea's issue. I think quite a few will be more knowledgeable and insightful than Bob EINHORN. I think he's not a great policy practitioner. He's also very, I think, excellent big picture thinker. I think a key issue of North Korea is how to head off their growing nuclear threat. For that part, I think both China and the United States were equally just obliged to something. So then U.S. could also just press hard, but the problem is how China also could rein in North Korea. I think that also questions endures for years. But so far, what is I think pleasing the region is I see that China is leaning more towards Seoul and Washington. Would they like to build some sort of collaboration and coordination. Then force North Korea recognize their contemplate or the dream of holding a nuclear weapon will completely risky and even will pave the way for them to go dead. If we can also send such a unified message, I think the things will be getting probably more achievable in the settlement of the North Korea issue. So I strongly favor the idea we should let North Korea know there's no chance, no space for Pyongyang to play. They always want to play out among bigger powers, swaps their, behavior patterns, but now we need a consistent. Then last point I want to just very briefly touch on is China-Japan relations. It seemed to me China-Japan relations is more like a strategic library than the China-US relations. I think the reason is also very simple. First of all, I think the Chinese, Japanese were much fueled by a very contentious nationalism. So it's hard to find a way, just the way say, exit. Then second is, we say such a geopolitical proximity now is simmering and brewing and turning into some sort of new element, not just to keep both sides in reconciliation, but keep both sides far apart. So you can imagine what's the Diaoyu Senkaku Island. It's uninhabited, small rockets. Then there's a lot of fake report. The area is rich of resources, but there's no solid evidence to show it is real. We say the area rich of the resources. But the problem is that island's disputes now is misleading both powers and again then age into the war. So China-Japan's relation and its variation, very ominous, very stern, and very dangerous. We say variation is another leading factor now is troubling the regional security. So my view is this. I don't think the Chinese and Japanese will consume just reconcile. The reason is domestic politics. I think Professor Park is a leading Japan hand. He will share his great insights with you. But my view is that so far there's no way Chinese and Japanese could back down. For example, Xi Jinping say Abe should recognize the existence of territorial disputes. But conversely, Abe said, no way. So we can't just, back down from some sort of objection of existing territorial disputes. So then, such things were not just changed. Then how China-Japan relations could be still, resting in some sort of relatively good ground. I think a key issue is both sides should be highly aware such a very, very dangerous, the prospect for both just even accidentally bump up at the sea. If we cause the death, if we cause some sort of, we say, blooding, then I think that kind of damage to the both sides will be much harder to redress. So then, at the core of the China-Japan relations is not how disputes we are, is how realistically we can just control the damage in the coming years. So let me quickly get back to my conclusion. First of all, I think the China-US relations is very interesting. Yes, strategic rivalry is on the horizon. But I think it's also a very interesting mix. On the one hand, we see strategic competition is deepening, but on the other hand, we see some sort of cooperation is also broadening. So how the US-China relations could really find a new way to rest on some sort of enduring, stability. Now it's a taste. New type of power relations is answer. I'm very skeptical. But anyway, I consider the primary motive of initiating the new type of power relations, I think it is good because Xi Jinping highly recognized we need to offer U.S. assurance. But the problem is such an assurance couldn't just stop over rhetoric and some sort of words. We need action. That's what the Chinese should take more seriously. But on the U.S. side, just let's say, don't overreact to the China's rise. So China is an existential threat? No, I completely disagree. Look at China. China is learning to be a great power. China is much obsessive to domestic transformation. but China is destined to be a big guy. Then we are most neighbor in the world, both in land and in sea. How can China just struggle through some sort of, the way for better off? I think the China situation deserves a lot of concern, deserves a lot of attention, and even sympathy. Last point is China-Japan relations. Most important thing is we should stop turning nationalism into antagonism. If both Tokyo and Beijing couldn't know how dangerous the stakes are, I think that kind of damage really will just, turn over regional security order in coming years. Thanks.
Our last but not least speaker will be Professor Park Cheol-hee.
Thank you, Chairman. In this session, we are talking about emerging challenges in Northeast Asia. I'm not that much worried about rising China. I'm not worried about hegemony in the United States. I'm not worried about increasingly confident Korea. I'm worried about two countries who are very much frustrated in this region. One is North Korea, the other is Japan. North Korea is frustrated because their security survival instinct is challenged by many things. And they know that even though they are developing nuclear weapons, they know that Soviet Union collapsed with tons of nuclear weapons. So they have reasons to be frustrated. Then why Japan is frustrated? Japan was the number 2 world economy, but surpassed by China a few years ago. And then their economy is stagnating. One of the reasons why Abe is so popular is that he gave some hopeful message to the Japanese people that you can revive the nation. So his catchphrase is making Japan strong again. So that's the reason why the phrase is so accepted to Japanese is that they wanted to see the glory of the nation again, rather than just downgrading into the second-rate country in the global society or region. So with the advent of Abe, they are trying to do things like a much more proactive defense, and then reorganizing the economy again, and even changing the mindset of the Japanese people. So, but if you look from inside, it looks okay. But if it is seen from outside, it gives a lot of troubles to the neighboring countries. So among all the challenges we have discussed, we are faced with two unprecedented, unprepared, unknown challenges we have seen. That is one, China-Japan conflict. The other is Korea-Japan conflict. We are not prepared. We were not expecting that kind of the rivalry and conflict among the neighboring countries that so much. But now that's the main concern of all the intellectuals and policymakers looking at this region. Why Japan is so frustrated? Because Japan does not know how to deal with rising China, not only psychologically, also physically. So they are losing their power, capability to deal with the rising China. And then psychologically very much frustrated because China is excelling Japan. And then they are always sidelined. So the conference like this, Japan is not called anymore. As Japan is not fully prepared for this kind of situation, they wanted to find ways to deal with the rising China. So they are relying on all kind of tactics, internal balancing, upgrading their defense capability, external balancing, coalition with the United States and other neighboring countries, and then possibly in order to have a diplomatic leverage against the rising China, if possible, they want to encircle China making all good relationship with neighboring countries, including Southeast Asian countries. So they're doing it, but they're not fully satisfied about it. So that's the reason why they are trying to go with a defense revisionism. They think that they are one foot and one hand is tied up by legal constitutional constraints. So if possible, they wanted to free it up so that they can use their defense capability much more freely than before. But that gives a kind of very alarming signal to the neighboring countries, especially to China and Korea. So it's a kind of, that's the fundamental reason why we have a conflictive relationship and perception. Focal point is, of course, the Senkaku Taudai Islands, because that's the flashpoint, the first contact point between China and Japan. Then why Japan is so frustrated with Korea? Korea should be a natural ally, natural friendly partner to Japan, because Korea and Japan share allied relationship with the United States. But Japan is very frustrated because in the eyes of the Japanese, Koreans are repeatedly asking apology, repentance, and compensation about the historical controversies that they think it's ended. So it is very hard to understand from the Korean mindset, but Japanese think like that. Koreans are too much preoccupied with historical issues. And then there is no escape from it. So how to deal with it? So they are kind of, so that's the reason internally, in order to have the national pride and confidence in the context of rising China, they wanted to breed more confidence and pride among the nations, the people. Then that's the reason why they wanted to revise their historical perspective. But this history revisionism is giving a lot of troubles to the neighboring countries like Korea and China. Because we cannot accept it. So if you understand the situation from that perspective, some understandable but never excusable. Interestingly enough, the regional powers in this region are taking advantage of this situation for their national interest. I think most frustrated nation would be United States. You wanted to see a trilateral cooperation among United States and Japan and Korea to cope with the rising China, also to engage China together. So in that sense, the conflict between Korea and Japan is a kind of the everlasting agony for the United States. That's the reason why Obama pushed Park Geun-hye and Abe together, and then here, okay, you talk to each other. Successful in The Hague, but I don't know whether we can go on and on. Even though Professor Lee Jung suggested the idea of the United States playing a very good mediating role, I think it's the task of the Japan and Korea independently, without the mediation of the United States, to face the reality and solve the problem. Whether you can do it or not, that's the kind of big challenge in coming months. China, I think, frankly speaking, I think China is enjoying the situation. Because if you put a wedge between Korea and Japan, you can manipulate the situation to China's advantage. North Korea is always in your hand. If you can bring Korea into China's hands, yes, you can play the game much more interestingly. You don't have to. China doesn't have a big temptation to make Korea-Japan relationship better, because it serves the Chinese interest. Then what about Japan? I think Japan is very much frustrated, but it's not bad, because they can consolidate the Japanese mindset and then nurture the spirit that we should unite to face rising China. And then the Japanese people should be much more, they have to speak out what they wanted to say in the immediate neighbors. They couldn't do that. Now they wanted to do that. That's the reason why we see all those pejorative expressions in the weekly magazines in Japan. I'm sick and tired of all this the media coverage in Japan. But that serves the domestic political purpose rather than strategic interest of Japan. So in that sense, Japan is enjoying the domestic political game rather than strategic game in the region. What about Korea? Korea is very much uneasy about having a troubled relationship with Japan, but it's Japan's problem. Why should Korea hurry up amending the relationship on the South Korean initiative? Of course, we know that we have to make the relationship better, but Japan, you did the wrong thing. So correct your problem first. So I will wait for your action rather than just to beg any kind of things to Japan. And then our immediate challenge is to deal with provocative North Korea. Among the regional powers, who is the kind of good support for this kind of situation? China? Because in order to deal with North Korean situation, US and China are critically important for Korea, because without a mediation of them, we cannot handle North Korea independently. So that's the reason why China is cherished by Korean diplomacy, not because we love China that much. So in that sense, we are all taking advantage of the situation. But what should be done? I think all the countries in the region should have a very, very balanced approach. We should not balance against each other. We should have a balanced approach to deal with neighboring countries. First of all, Korea should have a good relationship with Japan and China altogether. Now it's lopsided to China. So I think we have to have to normalize the relationship with Japan as soon as possible. Also, China should take a much more balanced approach rather than just pushing Japan to the corner and then trying to bring Korea into your court. I think the retrieving good relationship with Japan serves the interest of China as well. And then U.S. should be balanced. So I fully agree with Zhu Feng's point that the U.S. should not overreact to China's rise. And another thing I wanted to mention is that the ground for bettering the relationship among regional countries is that Japan should seriously reconsider their history revisionism. Abe wants to do it, but all the neighboring countries do not like it. Abe wants to do it. United States is not in favor. Korea, absolutely no. China, absolutely no. North Korea, of course. European countries, no. So every countries are raising the voice of no to Japanese history revisionism. So that's the reason why Japan should consider history revisionism in order to make the regional environments much better. Finally, I think Korea should play a much more active role in facilitating communication among the regional powers, and then induce habits of cooperation among three countries. In that sense, I think Korea should take much more active initiative to set up the trilateral Northeast Asia Summit, Korea, Japan, and China, as soon as possible. I want to see it in the first half of this year. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are already 15 minutes, behind timeline. So I will give just very brief, the question to all of you. The first question may be addressed to Bob and Professor Sun. So as you properly mentioned, the most serious situation might be sometime when United States and international community believe that North Korean nuclear missile could threat to the mainland or Guam of United States. So, but that cannot be done overnight. So maybe we usually think about three prerequisites: how far they could hit. Second, how they could make it more miniaturization of their warhead. The second, re-entry skill. These three elements should be proved. So from our point, North Korea will have some endless trial and test till United States believe in that way. So how we could prevent, not to do that. So where is the red line or bottom line, whatever language is? So my concrete question will be, what if North Korea make another round of nuclear test, for example? So maybe Professor Son and Bob could have some reply. Well, anybody's.
China tests until it commanded all this technology. India and Pakistan continue, and U.S. sanctions them and to no avail. In the same logic, I would say North Korea is resourceful in its determination, human resource, and technological and financial resource. They would divert the resource for this purpose. Therefore, it will continue. Yes, they will proceed to test and to conduct more nuclear weapon detonation, with or without our objection. Be prepared for it. Every day I'm prepared, so I never feel surprised. They will stop. They will continue. I would only be surprised if they would not do. So how to deal with this? To have a goal, denuclearization is too high. I would say freezing, don't do more. Capping, this is the upper limit. And third, so it's arms control and then disarmament. It's not disarmament first, it's first arms control. But that means politically we fail. We often fail. The U.S. does not want China to have a nuclear weapon. U.S. failed. U.S. does not want to have even Israel to have a nuclear weapon. U.S. failed. And P5 all want India and Pakistan to not to develop. We failed. Why not to have another fail? But China, U.S. can manage it to have new type of major power relationship. North Korea aspire, dream to have new type of asymmetrical partnership. So if China, U.S. would continue to improve relationship when they continue to have nuclear weapon, we exactly encourage North Korea to repeat this. So we do many things that conflicts with our overall objective. But then we will continue to behave this. So therefore, I do frustrate many of my audience that I'm prepared, that they would have this for a long time to go. And eventually they would become a mature country. India does not threaten other countries with nuclear weapon. But without Indian nuclear weapon, China-Indian relationship will not be stabilized. I'm not commending India's nuclear weapon, but the Indian nuclear weapon exactly serves the purpose to stabilize China-Indian relationship. Otherwise, China would have the superiority. I'm strong, I'm great, I can defeat you in conventional warfare, and you don't have nuclear weapon. They must have nuclear weapon to counterbalance China's any sense of superiority. And I'm not encouraging North Korea to think this way, but I cannot control them. They exactly want to repeat what we have succeeded. Therefore, they will continue.
Okay, Bob.
I'm also pessimistic, as Dingli is, about prospects for denuclearizing North Korea. But I think, however unrealistic, denuclearization must remain our goal. We cannot accept the fact that they have achieved this status and will continue it eternally. But I think our objective should be an incremental approach. I think it is important to cap this capability so that they don't succeed in achieving a long-range ability to strike the United States and to improve their capability even to strike their close neighbors. It would be useful to pursue this incremental agenda to try to reestablish some kind of a negotiating process. But that process wouldn't make any sense unless the North Koreans were prepared to say the purpose of this negotiation is to achieve the ultimate denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We can't enter into a negotiation where the North Koreans are saying these are negotiations among countries with nuclear weapons, and the objective is not denuclearization. And before you can begin that negotiation, North Korea has to take a number of steps to indicate that it's sincere, that this is its goal, even if it's a goal that cannot be achieved in one step. It has to be achieved incrementally. And I think that's where the problem is today in China's efforts to reconstitute this negotiation. What are the minimum requirements? What are the gestures? What are the statements? What are the measures North Korea must take to demonstrate that it's prepared to go down the road toward denuclearization, even if that ultimate objective is a long way away?
Okay, you mentioned what do you mean by long missile? I think you mean you implied the ICBM, but Professor Lee Jung-hoon mentioned that even some threat to Guam area, it might be serious one. So, Professor Lee, do you have anything to respond his? I mean, to the level of the when we could have some threat. So he mentioned a long missile, but you mentioned some Guam,
Right. Well, I mentioned the American forward bases. So what I meant by that, it doesn't necessarily have to be San Francisco or Washington or Chicago. That there are significant American forward bases of U.S. interests that could be seriously threatened by North Korea, if North Korea is to have deployed nuclear weapons. So it doesn't necessarily have to resort to ICBMs. I might just take the opportunity to I fully agree that we have to stay on this course of aiming to denuclearize North Korea. I don't think we can really accept at some point, we accept North Korea as a nuclear state. I don't think that should be our goal. I think our goal has to be to dismantle North Korean nuclear weapons. But what is on the table today is just not doing the job. So we really have to think deep into then what options do we have to can we consider? I remember like in the 1980s, for example. I mean, it's not necessarily nuclear issue, but South Africa and of course its apartheid system, the discrimination system, and there was a major international campaign to dismantle that apartheid system. And for example, in U.S. university campuses, students would demonstrate to tell the university authorities to divest from whatever there's the endowment, that endowment going into some companies, like for example Nestle, that has stakes or interests in South Africa, to target those companies to divest from South Africa. And I think these and then of course the sports boycott and all sorts of boycott and campaign against South Africa, which eventually led to the dismantling of the apartheid and democratization of that country. Now, I'm not so sure if that's perfectly applicable to the North Korean situation, because there's not a whole lot of multinational corporations in North Korea. But I'm sure that we can find ways to really make North Korea feel the pain in a way that it will say at some point that maybe we have to give up the nuclear weapons. I think that's something that we have to find, and we're not finding that. We're not putting in enough efforts to find what it will really take to make North Korea budge.
Okay, Richard, you have.
Three quick points. I agree with Bob that it would be a great thing if North Korea recommitted to denuclearization. The problem is that its definition of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is very different from ours. It means the abandonment of the alliance. Second, I agree that an incremental approach is good and that freezing would be a good idea. Unfortunately, that was what the leap year agreement from 2012 was designed to accomplish, and North Korea walked away. Third, I agree with Ambassador Park that the actual deployment of a capability that can hit the United States is probably a long way away, but extended deterrence is a very psychological phenomenon. And once the Republic of Korea and Japan conclude that the ultimate goal is to be able to hit the United States, all the fears and anxieties kick in right away. And so you have to address them in the near term rather than wait for the long term. Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to give another question to Chinese side. I mean, Professor Feng and Sun Li. Traditionally, Chinese, the foreign policy, Chinese policy toward the Korean Peninsula could be summarized in two ways. Pursuit of the peace and stability of Korean Peninsula and denuclearization of Korean Peninsula. So these two goals has been, the cornerstone. But in 2009, there was some debate. It is reported there was some debate. If these two elements are in conflict each other, then which will go first? And then, everybody knows, at the time, Chinese leaders more emphasize on peace and security of Korean Peninsula on top of, rather than denuclearization. So maybe we call it, this is made by Weiss, Lingdao Xiaozhu. Foreign affairs leading small group of CPC. So I wonder if there's any real changes from that position. Otherwise, even though people say that there is some different perception, Chinese perception vis-a-vis North Korea has been changed. But without, this key policies changes, I don't know, as Bob mentioned, China will enjoy, and North Korea will enjoy, and development of North Korean nuclear program without impunity. So this is my point.
Okay, I think it's a really a long-term controversy of Chinese policy of DPRK. So which one will be more reliably and more legally just prioritized? It's a instability of Korean Peninsula, or it's a denuclearization. Yes, we also see China's state media usually just change some sort of order, and they sometimes just take the denuclearization first, and sometimes just put the instability or stability, we say, at the first. My view is that it seemed to me now for Beijing, it's also increasingly awareness. No matter how we press North Korea harder, but the denuclearization is really difficult. So if we still just was wobbling through between which one will be taken first, then it still will leave a great space for North Korea to enjoy. So then I remember it's very exactly since the third nuclear test, Wang Yi and some sort of was a foreign ministry spokesman, the comments, and we will see denuclearization very fairly and also very, very squarely just appeared at the first. But at the same time, we also see some controversy because different officials also will use the different orders. But my view is that, just as Professor Park just mentioned, for example, how enjoyable China will be to look at the lingering tension between Seoul and Tokyo. I think at least it's a great leverage for President Park. So if Beijing wants to use the Seoul as a very important, some sort of, we say, cooperator against Japan's history revisionism, then Beijing also pay back over North Korea policy. So then we also see last, June, the President Park visited Beijing, and she really had some sort of a chemistry with the Chinese President Xi. So I hope that she will return some sort of a state visit to the Seoul. Then the both countries could use the Japan factor to, energize some sort of their cooperation. So I really hope the Korean could play a bigger role over that.
Do you have anything?
I think stability is our purpose. Denuclearization, I would say, is an approach which would facilitate the realization of the purpose. So far, we have been frustrated that the approach has not worked, but we would not abandon our approach. This remains our firm approach in partner with our other friend. And given enough time, I think we should be able to manage both the approach and the end game.
I have another question addressed to Professor Lee Jung-hoon and Professor Park on Japanese issues, including because I have to include one of the questions. Professor Lee implied some positive role of the United States in narrowing the gap, based on our experience during the normalization between Korea and Japan in 1965. At the same time, this question, the memo points out dark side of the United States, especially in the signing time of the 1951's, the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So he argued that at that time, 1951 is just in the wake of Korean War. So Japan could enjoy much more benefit of ambiguity. So especially Dokdo Island case, it was omitted, even though in draft, it was inserted, but in the last version, it was omitted. So he mentioned that. So how we could balance this kind of the dark side and the bright side of United States role in bridging the gap. So.
I think we could talk hours on this, but I think lunch is waiting, so I don't know how best to be brief about this. Surely the San Francisco Peace Treaty signed in 1951 is a product of the intensification of the Cold War. China and its former Soviet Union did not participate. It was very important to bring Japan into the Western camp. And I guess one could make the argument that that as a result, some of the touchy issues dealing with the issues that's still present today might have been skirted. So true that if, for example, Dokdo was designated as the outermost island forming Korean sovereign territory, then I guess we would not have this issue today. Maybe not. I mean, Japan might have said that we cannot accept that for whatever reasons. But I don't think we can just mull over what had happened back in early 1950s. We just have to move forward with what is on the table. And I think comfort women issue, textbook issues, Yasukuni issues are quite separate from the Dokdo issue. Dokdo issue, I'm not really sure if we're going to be able to solve it. One has to give up the claims. I don't see that happening, not in my lifetime, I don't think. But there are things that can be done over issues like comfort women issue. And comfort women issue is, it's sometimes, well, it is often looked at as a bilateral issue, but I don't think it's just a bilateral issue. It's a issue of, with implications for universal principles and values. And I think Japan, as the economic leader and as a state that wants to be a normal state as well, has to address these issues in earnest if it wants to not only improve relations with South Korea, but wants to play a much more, morally and ethically adroit position in its global activities. So I'm not so sure if I'm addressing the question properly, but I'm personally frustrated that Japan is not able to address issues that it can address, and that may not include Dokdo, but certainly comfort women issue and maybe textbook issues. We hope that there's an improvement in that direction. Then maybe we don't need the active American intervention to improve relations. I was just mentioning the U.S. role because it doesn't seem like under the current circumstances, I don't know, maybe Professor Park has different opinion, but if it's left to us, it doesn't look like there's going to be a significant breakthrough, not anytime soon.
Okay, Professor Park.
I do not deny the very important role played by the United States. I welcome it, and then I like it. I like the idea. But the thing is that you should not misunderstand the fact. I don't think the United States is supporting the position of Korea at the expense of Japan. That's not the case. I don't think the United States is moving because of a high moral standard. I don't believe it. The reason why the United States is jumping into issue is that it is directly challenging the interest of the United States. Let's forget about the strategic interest, but about just the historical issue only. The Abe is trying to change the peace constitution. Who constituted Japanese constitution? Of course, Japanese. But during the occupation, U.S. plugged in Article 9, punitive peace. And then Abe and his close aides are visiting Yasukuni Shrine. We think what is the main problem, essence of the problem? A-class war criminals. Who sentenced the A-class war criminals? Tokyo Tribunal, Allied powers, right? So the other issues are all United States is directly and indirectly involved in all those historical things. That's the reason why you don't want to raise up your voice, but move silently to tame Japan. You know what you're saying? You are challenging the order we have made together after the war. So that's the reason why the United States is actively playing the role to mediate the two allies and then tame Japan. Because if you just let it go, I would say that the strong anti-American element will grow in the Japanese society. I don't think the U.S. can leave it alone. So that's the reason why U.S. is quite interested in the issue, not because of Korea, not because of Japan. So, but in that context, the role that the United States can play is raise the agenda, the issue, and to leave the kind of legitimate concern to Japan silently, and then advise Japan to take much more strategic perspective. But solutions should be found between Korea and Japan rather than just to ask the United States to find a solution. I don't think the US can find a solution at all.
Okay, thank you. As a moderators, I don't test your tolerance before the lunch. But I have some, the last, but the least, not the least in the question, that is maritime dispute issues. So I'd like to ask, to Chinese colleague. I will give another chance. On the maritime dispute issues, if my memory is correct, in the middle 80s, then Deng Xiaoping suggested some co-development, the natural resources and etc. In the dispute area, while shelving the territorial dispute issues for the time being. I mean, till the next generation solve the problem. But now, it seems that you mentioned that you asked some sympathy because, the China feels more insecure than before. But I think, the current current development is a reverse way. I mean, they have some China seems to have more confidence. So in dealing with the outside neighboring countries. So maybe my question is that the Deng Xiaoping's the basic doctrine or guideline is still alive, or still valid, or you are trying you already changed your position. Yeah.
Basically, I don't think that Beijing give up Deng Xiaoping's instruction of, let's say, shelving the territorial disputes and seeking the we say common development. Then there's a lot of, for example, the condemnation of the China's behavior at the South China Sea as assertiveness, but never forget. Back to in 1988, back to in 1991, when once used the military force, coercing something into the Chinese hand, vis-a-vis Vietnamese and the Philippines. But that time, did you hear a lot of China bashing? Did you hear a lot of the Chinese some sort of misconduct at the South China Sea? In the 10 years, I think recently we never try any military tool. So at the core for Beijing's policy, it seemed to me, is to remain very defensive. But the problem is, China is really getting stronger. For example, the number of the China's Coast Guard ship, its tonnage, really, just how to say, mounting very impressively. So then, now the international media narrative is just one-sided, leaning towards some sort of a small neighbors, then putting the finger to China's nose, say, you are bully. I have to say China's approach so far over the maritime issue, South China Sea and East China Sea, is genuinely problematic. Sometimes we are really not nuanced and sophisticated. Sometimes our China's response feels rude. But I don't think we really overturn some sort of a traditional legacy of a Deng Xiaoping's instruction. So then another thing is we also have to just pay more attention. Whereas the U.S. pushing back, then even Japan and the Philippines, they now is very smartly exploiting some sort of such a big, strategic presence of the U.S. in the region. For example, the Filipinos use the warship, coercing the Chinese fishing boats. Of course, it's very inflammatory. But someone say the Philippines hasn't got any Coast Guard ship. They have only such a warship. So they use this to place some sort of a maritime order. But anyway, it's just I say, a very controversial story. So then my view is that it's a time for the region, including China, reconsider the stability of maritime security. Otherwise, I think a maritime issue will be a very inflammatory source of some sort of very bad strategic rivalry, not just between Washington and Beijing, but also between Beijing and Tokyo. Thanks.
Professor Sun?
For both East China Sea and South China Sea, East China Sea on Diaoyu Island, China's line of logic is this. We made a tacit agreement with Japan to share with the dispute. We have made effort, but Japanese, not a government, unilaterally pushed the envelope by nationalizing the three main islands. That is the change of status quo. But they think this is not, because they are entitled to do this. But we differed with them. And we think now we have the capacity to have the tit for tat. Yes, we also change the status quo, but we are forced, we respond to you, and we are entitled. Therefore, this is the conflicting perspective. Japan considered China is not entitled. China thought Japan is not entitled. Japan thought I can do, China considered if you can do, I can do more to let you to feel regret. I think both feel insecurity. Japan may think if I don't do in the future, I may never have a chance to do. China thought in the past I have to share the dispute because I was weak. Now I'm less weak. I can no longer tolerate your bad behavior. But I still think neither country want to have a war. We need somebody. We need a number of conflict resolution mechanism, negotiation, but based on the agreement that there is dispute. So China needs Japan to admit there is dispute, or mediation, either America or someone else or Korean friend, shuttling between China and Japan to help block the peace, or go to court. I highly recommend my government to go to court. Since it's ours, why we don't sue Japan? Japan should sue China. Since it's yours, why don't you don't sue China? It's a human wisdom. We invented ICJ to settle the dispute. We should use the ICJ rather than to waste it. And for South China Sea, China's argument, a line of logic is that from the time immortal, all this island belong to us, which I do not agree. But at least from the time 1947, when our previous government announced that all these rock feature belong to China, why you were silent? Your silence made China's claim to be legitimate. And a number of countries, Philippines, Vietnamese, used the direct or indirect, explicit or inexplicit way to admit China's claim. But in the recent 20, 30 years, they negated their earlier stance, and they took some of the island. So China has maximized its self-restraint not to make it an issue. In the eyes that we can tap your water and to fish in your EEZ. It's your EEZ, it's not my EEZ. So I would have some need to use your resource, but you have already been aggressive in taking my rock. Could we make a compromise? So that's China's strategy. We know where we are weak, and we know where they are weak. We want to make a compromise. But what happened is that they occupied our land, they think it's theirs, and they don't allow us to do some economic activity. So they want to have all win and China all lose. That's unreasonable. I think China should sue them in the ICJ for their illegal occupation of those rocks. They should sue China in the International Court for the Law of the Sea for China's controversial use of their resource. And then the two sides can make a compromise. This time China is not suing them, and China is being sued. And it looks that China is on the defense. Yes, China is on defense, but they are totally on the defense since they used to be either silent or to explicitly or inexplicitly to admit that these rocks belong to China, and they negated it. So it's a dispute. So all observers should have those holistic view to observe how to help make this kind of dispute to be settled peacefully. Negotiation, arbitration, and mediation. I hope our Korean friend, and I saw the former CG in Shanghai from India, he is now the ambassador. India can help China and Philippines to avoid the conflict.
Okay, Richard, you have some final.
I'd just like to endorse Professor Park's previous statement that this is something that Japan and Korea need to do on their own. I think the U.S. can facilitate the beginning of the process, but it would be very hard to mediate it. First of all, because it's not clear that Japan and Korea would trust us all through the mediation. Second, we have history issues of our own with both Korea and Japan, and that is a complication. Thanks.
Okay, I received many questions, but I think I already incorporated into my questions. But I have the only one which I cannot incorporate it. That is, how long do you think North Korean Kim Jong-un regime will last? So I don't like this kind of guesswork. But as a last service to our audience, who tolerate the luncheon, if you have anything, anybody could. Okay, from you.
I think I know. If there no sudden execution of Zhang Songtai, I think they would have longevity. But after that, I know I can no longer say this.
No, the guesswork. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, again, let's give some big applause for our